I was asked to come down here in 1997 to a country that I'd rarely heard of, and a university I had no idea about. And actually, it was 1996 because it was the Atlanta Olympics. Giancarlo called me and said, I couldn't pronounce his name at the time, anyway, some guy. And finally, we arranged for me to come down here. And it's been one of the best career moves of my life. I tell people, this is my intellectual and spiritual home, although I'm not here that much. So I'm happy I had the opportunity to be here during this celebration of the life of the founder of this wonderful university. I'll try not to get too emotional, but I wanted to share with you some of my observations and memories. And this is Don Muso. This is a dear friend, an inspiration, a guru. He taught me a lot about many different things. And despite having a PhD in economics and having taught many years, I learned quite a bit about economics from Don Muso. Now, he was the greatest figure behind this university. But the best was his wife, Olga. I'm sure he would, just like here, this is the Milton Friedman Auditorium, but outside is the Rose Friedman area. And Milton Friedman, like Don Muso, would say that his wife deserved a lot of credit for many of his accomplishments. And I think I'm not speaking out of turn in suggesting that. Now, this was a photo of us not so many years ago. And they exceptional people in that regard. And they made me feel special, even though they made most people feel special. It's an incredible talent. I felt like when I was with them, I was perhaps one of the most important things other than their own children and family. But they had that capacity. They had that sort of willingness to embrace people. And it left it had a big effect on me. So, now what is a great man? Well, someone with integrity. Now, my estimation, Muso would never make promises he could not meet. So he was true to his word. He would always keep his word. Courage. Muso had this idea that he would try things that were impossible to make them possible. Now, founding this university, I tell the story, and I told this in front of Muso at a dinner party, and he didn't correct me. But before the university, was founded, Muso was sort of contemplating what Guatemala was all about. It was a poor country, so-called banana republic, if you will, that seemed to be going nowhere. There was a lot of poverty. So he went off to the U.S. and met all these people that had some ideas about how to develop policies that would allow a country to advance. And so he began inviting these people, Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, von Mises, names that all of you have encountered in your studies. And they would speak to his friends. And they said, well, this is great, but it's only us and the audience that hear these things. And so the way I told the story, I make up the numbers. He said, okay, all of you give me $100 each. He said, Muso, why would we give you $100? He said, well, I'll start a think tank. Well, what's a think tank? Never mind. Give me the $100, and I'll translate these speeches that were in English into Spanish, and then we'll circulate them. So that was the SEIS, the beginning of SEIS. And so they said, oh, Muso, this is going great. People are reading these translations, and they're having a big impact. But what about our kids? Our kids, they'll go to this Marxist, well, Trump would call it some kind of hole, but this San Carlos, they'll go there and they'll be indoctrinated with all this Marxist propaganda. He said, give me $1,000 each. I said, what? Why would we give you $1,000? He said, I'll start a university. Muso, a university? You're not an academic. What is... Now, this was the magic of Muso. He had good friends that trusted him and trusted his judgment. And they supported him in this wonderful institution that you're now sitting in. Now, he didn't correct me, so that was more or less the way it went. It was impossible to start a university. Where would you... There weren't private universities, not as there are now. I mean, there were some connected with the church or whatever. So, humility. Muso bragged about his failures. Most people brag about, what did I do good? Muso bragged about, because failures teach you about life. It's through having failures that you have life experience. If everything worked perfectly well, you're either delusional, but he liked to talk about his failures. He talked about Don Carlos Montes and Felix Montes, how they had different business ventures that went broke because they were too young, too stupid, whatever. And he talked about these a lot. I found that fascinating. Responsibility. Muso was a family man first, and then he brought in his friends, and then his country. And his country was Guatemala. He did have an American passport, which he gave up, I think, as a part of the running for president. So it was seen as not maybe necessary, but probably good politics. Wisdom. I learned a lot from him. And Muso was better at asking questions or listening than he was pontificating. That is, telling you or showing you how smart he was. He wanted to know how smart you were. What did you know? What could he learn from? So this is a wise man. This is asking the questions, not giving answers. Compassion. There was no tendency for Muso to exploit others' weaknesses. He was looking, I think my impression was, if he saw a weakness in another person, he would try to help them get over that weakness. Discipline. He had a very strong work ethic. He wrote columns. He was involved in all sorts. I'll talk about some of the organizations later. But he had a lot of things. He had 6 children. I don't know how many grandchildren came out of that. Big family. He ran businesses. He, began, like I say, think tanks and so on. And he traveled quite a bit to the U.S. to find like-minded people. And I'll talk about some of them. Resilience. Again, as I mentioned, if you ask him, he had a lot of failures. He was proud of them. It was life experience. You learn from them, and you hopefully don't make them again. Leadership. As I mentioned, because of his personality, his intelligence, his sort of presence, he was able to convince people that he could be trusted and that he would be a leader among them. And again, I was very fortunate when I first came to have met many of the founding members of the supporters of Muso, many of whom have passed on, unfortunately. Love and service. Muso understood and was very generous with me. He was generous with his time, generous to let me get to know his family, to be part of this university. But generosity is not based on altruism. It's not something that you do because it's the right thing, because, you do it because you feel that you're helping the other person improve themselves. So, very generous in that regard. Now, how did he get to be known as Muso? Well, he told me the story once over lunch many years ago, so I'm hoping I get it right, because I'll be corrected and scolded later if I'm not. A family friend who was then the Italian ambassador gave Muso, as a young man, a young boy, a small uniform that looked like the fascist uniforms of the Italian fascists at that time. And Muso, wore it proudly, and so the family, they made a joke because he was, being like the Mussolini, Muso. Now, so when he was telling me this story, I was saying, wait, this doesn't make sense. It's an unlikely nickname for someone who hates authoritarian government, who hates fascism, who hates communism, collectivism, authoritarianism in any form. But anyway, it was a nickname that stuck. So that's the origin of the name. Now, of course, it is the idea of Mussolini or the fascism, Nazism of that era is incompatible with the mission statement of this university. Now, the mission statement of this university is in direct opposition to the ideas that Mussolini or Adolf Hitler would have promoted. As you all know, this is a translation into English. To teach and disseminate the ethical, that is, what is the moral act of being a free and responsible individual? What is the legal basis for that? And what are the economic principles for a community of free and responsible individuals? Now, freedom without responsibility is empty. So this is a complete statement of what your professors and the administrators, all the staff here, are hoping to convey to you. How you can, what's the legal, ethical, and economic basis for behaving in this way? Well, it's the advancement of humanity. In particular, bringing Guatemala to a higher level of economic performance, a better standard of living for all the people of Guatemala, not just for some particular individuals. Now, his life was very long, but not long enough. He was still, prior to his illness with cancer, he was still, I was playing tennis with him maybe a year or two before that. One of the interesting anecdotes that was told to me is that when he went to Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, one of his I think they even were roommates, Carlos Montes, and they wound up in the cancer clinic in Houston toward the end of both of their lives. And Muso, in his inimicable sense of humor, he said, "We're roommates again." They both survived those treatments, but not for long after that. So we lost him in 2010. So his family moved from Guatemala to the U.S. and then Canada, and where he got his university degree in the U.S., and then moved back to Guatemala, I think in the 1950s. Now, he comes back to Guatemala after living in the U.S. and Canada, and he sees poverty, misery, underdevelopment. Now, of course, there were lots of people offering answers. The Marxists said that Guatemala was poor because of capitalism and the gringos. The gringos are exploiting us. We're suffering under capitalism. Well, Muso wasn't convinced of that. And then he looked at the structure of government and how the economic life was organized in Guatemala. And he saw, of course, oligarchic families. There were groups of families or certain producers, maybe coffee, bananas, sugarcane, whatever. And so they really seemed to dominate economic life. Now, the Marxists would say, oh, it's their fault, or the gringos' fault. And of course, Muso knew a lot of these families and people, and he said, well, that's not the full answer. So he began a quest to find out, how do we end this underdevelopment? How do we end this poverty in Guatemala? So he rejected this idea that this wasn't a full answer, and he rejected the communist insurgency, that the Soviets were sponsoring the Cubans to stir up the campesinos, and they were murdering Guatemalans. So this didn't seem the right answer. So this is where he began his quest. What's the best way to escape poverty and to improve the living quality of everyone here in Guatemala? So that led him to go to the U.S., in particular to be affiliated with the Foundation for Economic Education in New York. And there he met a great number of the people who are, many of the rooms, or like this auditorium, are named after some of those people. So he was able to develop some new ideas that weren't really well sort of understood perhaps, or certainly not discussed in Guatemala. What we would call either classical liberalism or libertarianism or anarcho-capitalism. There are lots of sort of variations, but the fundamental joining point of that is human liberty and personal dignity. Now, and they can deliver that. Now, socialism pretends to speak to human liberty, pretends to speak to personal dignity, but all the great experiments with that in the Soviet Union, Red China, did the exact opposite. They began with these principles, but they couldn't stay with them because socialism requires so much control over humans that eventually you lose your freedom and you lose your dignity. Whereas, markets and classical liberalism, these ideas, are more likely to deliver that. And where people are allowed to remain free, not in principle, according to socialism, but in practice, then people flourish. That is, they are able to use their entrepreneurial skills or their physical abilities, whatever it may be, to advance not just themselves, but others. So, this was the beginning. CES was founded in 1959 as a way of studying and developing ideas. So again, it sort of began with these translations of, speeches or essays that address the idea of expansive human liberty and advancement of personal dignity. That's what it's all about. So UFM began in 1971, and Muso remained president until, I think, 1988. I came in about 10 years after that when Fernando Monterroso was the rector. So Uh, my father had an expression. If someone was unique, he was a one-er, one of a kind, a one-er. It was an expression that he often used. Well, definitely Muso was a one-er. My father would have liked him very much. Now, what were his traits? Well, as I say, he was very modest. Like I say, the only time he bragged was about his failures. An immodest person would tell you about everything good about them. But he wasn't that kind of person. He never tried to put himself into the limelight to be the center of attention. He often was, but it wasn't his fault. Well, it was his fault. It was his fault because he was charming. It was his own attributes that made him the center of attention. He didn't demand it. He didn't require it. But he was this. When he came into the room, people would make him the center of attention. So it was their fault that he got that much attention. He was optimistic. He had to be. I mean, to be able to continue in these almost, I'm sure at times, thankless, problematic, impossible arrangements to get this university started. You had to be an optimist. I mean, he had to continue with that sort of, forward thinking that he imagined this audience sitting here. And here we are. That's a great man. They could do that. He realized that truth would always win. It may take time. I mean, look at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a bundle of contradictions, dictatorships, murdering of their population, lies to keep their population believing in this sort of socialist utopia. But the truth finally won out. Russia is certainly better than the Soviet Union, but it has its own problems, of course. So Muso had this idea that, truth will dominate. It may not, look, we're never going to have perfect outcomes. Certainly Russia under Putin is a terrible place, but it's better than it was under the Soviets because literally millions of people lost their lives in gulags or concentration camps. But Muso was realistic. I mean, if he was a complete utopian, nobody would listen to him. He understood what kind of problems would confront him in terms of financing. I mean, this campus is in a barranco. Who would use this for building a university? But he understood, well, we just have to design it so it'll work. Right? Now, so he's always trying to make the impossible possible. Okay, this is one of the, I remember my first visit here. We drove into the entrance for the catedráticos, docentes or whatever. And we drove up, and we're on this platform, and all I see is this little structure, which was the elevator shaft. And I thought, gosh, I know it's a poor country, but my God. Well, and then I came down. So, I mean, I was really like, what? Anyway, impossible to build here, but we're here. Now, so Muso, I think, and maybe, hopefully all of you accept this, that humans are, as a matter of being human, entitled to be free. Now, of course, your parents don't think that. Many of you live with your parents still, but, and most of you will, either rebel against it or, you know. But we're free at least once we escape the grasp of our parents. And we're entitled to that. So, and none of us should be the slave of anyone else or any institution, including governments. So this, if we begin with that idea, we begin with an allergy to the idea that governments should dominate us. That governments are there to serve us, not for us to serve them. But if you talk to public officials, they believe that, well, you have to earn money so we can tax you, so we can pay our salaries. We have, and think about this, governments have first claim to your income. Where'd that come from? You should have first claim to your income to spend on your family, your friends. But what happened over time is that we allowed democracies to create governments that tell us how to live our lives, instead of us telling government what we want them to do for us. Governments are telling you what you must do, either to support the government or someone you've never met before. That doesn't make sense. That seems to go against some fundamental human conditions. Now, Muso taught me a lot about this concept of the rule of law. Estado de Derecho, I think, is the common expression in Spanish. At the heart of that is no privileges. Governments cannot give privileges to one person or group that is not available to another. So a subsidy that you give to someone to buy an electric vehicle violates the rule of law. Why? Because someone else has to pay for it. A taxpayer has to give the money to the government for the government to give it to someone as a subsidy. That violates the rule of law because we have one group that is forced to serve another group. Virtually every piece of legislation that goes through every Congress or legislature or parliament violates this rule of law because it's all about representative democracy has become degraded into a redistribution game. Vote for me, and I'll take from him to give to you. That's what it's all about. And Muso understood this very well. And he was trying to, hopefully bringing these ideas to people like you so that you would change that. So that governments are no longer your master. Governments are supposed to be your slave, your servant. Not slave maybe, but servant. Now, Muso was deeply intelligent, but he masked it in a way. It wasn't so obvious because he was so jolly. His sense of humor, he was always making a joke, even when he was talking about some serious matter. So it was very disarming in that regard because you would learn painlessly. Many of you think that sitting through my lectures is painful, but with Muso it's painless because it was so well mixed with his infectious humor. It made people around him feel good. He was patriotic, but he wasn't nationalistic. He was patriotic because he loved this country. He loved things about this country, the food, the people, the places. But he wasn't nationalistic. That is, he didn't see that we need to make the Guatemala state nationalistic. And no, because he was a student of humanity. He was a student of, what makes a good life? What makes a good life is you start with being free. You have self-ownership, not only of your body, but everything you produce. And if the state wants some of that you produce, they have to ask for it, not demand it. And that was the original sort of understanding of modern democracy. He was a member of Congress from 1970 to 1974, and he was a candidate for president. I remember once there was a poster for Muso running for president that was on one of the, maybe Carretera Salvador, on the way there, and his son pointed it out to me many, many years ago. He was a member of the Central Bank Council. Now, this is really important because one of the aspects of the Constitution of Guatemala that I think has been very effective is that the Central Bank of Guatemala could not buy debt issued by the government. And this was a way of protecting you, future generations, from public sector debt that would be accumulated by, for example, my generation. And of course, politicians hated it because it put a brake on their capacity to borrow money. He was a dedicated husband and father. Again, I was very lucky to feel like I was certainly a close observer. I wasn't treated as a family member, but I was often in their home and with their children at various stages. And I saw that, and I remember with his grandson, we were watching TV, and grandfather and grandson were holding hands. It really touched me. I don't know why. I'll never forget that. Well, he's also an athlete. Here he is in action, playing volleyball. I don't know where. It may have been on it was at the old campus, I guess. Probably the old campus. Well, I'll get to that in a moment. Now, he had, again, a capacity to make complex ideas clear. So, these are quotes from him. In a very real sense, we compete to enrich others. Now, it seems like the focus on economic transfers here is competition. And that is an important aspect of economic activities. But in order to be enriched, you have to cooperate. So this is a very deep thought. And it encapsulates the whole market process in a way. We're competing to enrich others. In other words, I want that iPhone. And you and I are competing, and so we bid up the price of the iPhone to enrich, well, whoever. Stockholders, sellers. Same could be over a banana or taco or whatever. The free society is not a zero-sum game. In other words, again, this is a description of the market process. In markets, it's always both parties on both sides of the transaction win. You don't engage in a voluntary transfer unless you believe what you're getting is worth more than what you've given up. And both sides believe that. So, economic transfers are a positive sum game where both parties win. Now, to earn a buck, a buck is an expression for $1. To earn a buck, you have to increase the wealth of somebody else. Again, this is the market process. Again, he's and it makes you want to think about these things. What does that mean? Because it's not all laid out for you. But it gives an opportunity to explain how the market process works. So, for you to gain, they have to gain, is basically the statement. Or, again, it's another way of saying markets are a positive sum game. And this is great. He's dreaming about you. He wants to see Guatemala a place where there's shared prosperity, where people are free. Free to make failures, which he embraced, rather than lied about or tried to hide away from. But that's what freedom is. Freedom is not only about success, but it's about learning from failures. Better if you learn from other people's failures, but you learn from failures. Again, market processes. Prices are not arbitrary. So, why is an iPhone so expensive? Well, it's your fault, in part. You want one, and you have to compete with me. So prices are signals. Do people really want this thing? And are people willing to sell these things? I mean, there's a lot of complex technology in the iPhone. When you distort them with controls, in other words, you don't want governments or anyone else able to set the price. The price should be set by the buyer and the seller. Otherwise, there'll be distortions. Those distortions will be, you'll either have an undersupply of that particular product or an oversupply. So governments are very bad at deciding what is the correct price. The correct price is what you and I agree on. Simple as that. So when governments try to control prices, they make the economy blind and crippled so that the market will not function in the way it should or could. One of the great ironies is most times when we see that markets don't satisfy us, we blame the market for that. Well, who's the market? You're the market. Human beings are the market. Human beings that start businesses like Apple. Human beings that, produce things like coffee growers. And human beings that want them. The market is in essence, simply human action. The actions of humanity. People. So if you hate markets, you hate people. That's where the socialists get it wrong. They claim they love people, but their policies behave as though they hate people because they distort incentives, they lead to these shortages or surpluses. Now, your generation, at least in the United States, your generation is much more sympathetic to the ideas or the ideals or the ideology of socialism. Now, it sounds like a good idea. And again, if we start with some of their premises are reasonable. And they overlap with my own. But the practice, that's where you need to pay attention. Socialism promises equality. Now, the Soviets, Lenin and then Stalin, they said, we're all going to be made equal. We want to get away from the Tsar. The Tsar was above us. We're all equal. Well, of course, where did Lenin and Stalin live? In the Kremlin, which is a wonderful place. Actually, Lenin, in the beginning, had a really crummy room, but, of course, he had everything that the Tsar had at his disposal. The Chinese Communist Party did the same. We're all equal. And Mao lived in Tiananmen, where the emperors lived, of course. France, where are the leaders of the democracy in France live? They live in the old palaces. Not all equal. It delivers misery. Well, not in every country, but in almost Cuba. You've seen the photos of the Castros wearing Rolexes and Che Guevara wearing Rolexes. Where did they get them? They buy them? No, they took them off the dead bodies of the people they killed. Literally. Probably. I don't know that. Somebody else took them off the dead bodies and gave them to him, maybe. Now, socialism ignores human nature. Karl Marx, was a brilliant philosopher in terms of his capacity to construct a philosophical edifice. But he understood very little about humanity. He had his own ideas about it. He was a bit of a sociopath, misogynist, personally. So, Muso loved people. He's looking at your future. And look what he gave you. Whereas most socialists delivered misery to their people. Not all of them, but most of them. Now we get to the university. Why do we have a university? It's not to indoctrinate you. I tend to give pretty much one side of the picture. When it comes to, I'm teaching a course in law and economics and one in public choice. And I pretty much give my students what I think and what I've learned. But I really honestly leave it up to them to contest it. That is, if they have good evidence that I would be thrilled if I'm wrong to be proven wrong. So I don't feel like I indoctrinate my students, but I do I'm pretty confident that what I say is true or correct or applicable, and I wait for them to contest it. Now, what we're trying to do in Model King, at least as I understand it, is to teach you how to think. So maybe my one-sided view irritates a student, and he has to think about it. Then he has to come up with an argument against it, unless you're lazy. But it's up to you. And the purpose is that we want free human beings. Socialism is an aggregation process. It talks about society, which is arbitrary. What is society? Even what is the nation? Your borders have not always been what they are today. You used to have Belize. Never mind. Forget that. So, nations are just made up. It's something of that moment. But this is what socialists do. Now, classical liberalism is about disaggregation, starting with the individual as a human being and building from there. Whereas socialism pretends like these things exist. If you think society is real, try to cut it. Try to touch it. Human beings. Whoops. They're real. They're not an abstraction. They're not a conceptualization. But I'm losing. Here we go. So, that's a big difference. This is important. Every regulation that your legislature or SAT or whoever oversees a requirement, it is just like a tax. But it's not, the tax is not merely the money that you lose, but you lose the possibility for the person that's taxed to be more innovative. It takes away some, say, if I make 1 million quetzales and the state takes half of it, half of my effort goes to the state. Why should I put out so much exertion for that? I give up my family life, I lose sleep at night, I have ulcers, whatever. I become an alcoholic to get that money, and then they take it away. So people will be less innovative. Property rights are an inalienable part of being human. Property rights are an acceptance that someone owns something. Now, why do we believe that? Well, if you own yourself, no one can enslave you. No government, no individual, no institution. Then whatever you produce lawfully, without violence, should be yours. You're entitled to it. That's your private property. So we're not only talking about real estate. Private property is this jacket. I earned enough money to buy this jacket. No one should be able to take it away from me. And the state shouldn't come and take my sleeve because they think I should give some portion of it. So property rights are the essence of being human. It's the outcome of being human. Because if you're human, you want things and you acquire things. So if you don't have property rights, you don't have freedom. You don't have prosperity. And you don't have justice. That is, other people are able to take it away from you, whether it's the state or other individuals. This is really important. Politicians, well, governments, but politicians in particular, don't create wealth. They can only take from you to give to someone else. And very often, it's to themselves and their friends. I was working on a project. There was a tsunami, a giant wave that swept through much of Asia. And I was living in Indonesia at the time. And of the money that was set aside for the victims of this tsunami, where their houses were swept away or their children or parents, more than 30% went to administration. So, in other words, a lot of people working for the United Nations or different agencies were driving nice cars. So money that was meant to help people found its way in the pocket of government officials or international agency officials. 10 minutes. I'll try to give you a break at the end for questions. In modern political life, we don't fear tyranny as much as we might have several hundred years ago. The big problem is ignorance. That is, the unwillingness to understand, what does it mean to be human? Well, and to me, it's to own property, to be productive. What does it mean to be human? To be free, not to be someone's slave. But if we don't embrace those ideas, well, we just accept what Samia or the dominant political party tells us how we should live. You should decide how you should live. And Don Muso tried to provide this institution for you to learn so that you would change Guatemala. The future's in your hands, not mine. Now, that was me when I first came. Muso didn't like long hair. I don't know why. He might have liked me, but the first thing he would say was not, welcome back. It was like, why don't you get a haircut? Anyway, that was Muso. At his home, he had a library, and he said, I want you to come upstairs to my library. I want to show you a photo of one of my favorite economists who has long hair like you. So we go up, and there's a bookcase full of books. So we walk, and we get closer and closer to the wall, and then the bookshelf stops here, and there's the wall, and he says, there he is, this photo that nobody could see of Roger Leroy Miller, who was an economist that was known at that time. So that was funny. Now, one of the partners is here in the audience. We played tennis in the old tennis courts, which are no longer there. It's a parking lot or part of the medical school now, not very far from here. Now, when I played with him at home in the later years, he used an oxygen tank. And he would beat me soundly, but then he would go, and he'd go over, get oxygen. I thought, Jesus, if he dies, I'll never be invited back. But he would thrash me soundly, but he tolerated my poor performance. He was a great companion. At home or at other events, as I say, I was sitting next to him and I told this story about what I knew about the founding of the university. And it probably was all wrong, but he humored me. He was very gracious as a host, very generous. And life of the party, when he came to my parties, I gave parties, many people would come, and he and Olga would often come. He was armed but not dangerous. One day, he had his driver, we were sitting in the back seat, and he said, I don't know what the conversation was, but he said, oh yeah, these are bulletproof vests. There was a bulletproof vest on the front seat, and he was sitting on a bulletproof vest. I wasn't, but never mind. But I said, are those really necessary? And he said, well, I also have a gun. And he reached in the pocket on the back seat and dropped it. And this gun started flipping around. Maybe he was dangerous. But anyway, I survived. The gun didn't go off. Another one of my memories of time with him. He was involved, vice president of the Chamber of Commerce, president of the Stock Exchange, I think founding member, president of his last activity was this civil society organization which aimed to sort of make constitutional changes to codify the rule of law and property rights. Many global influencers came here. He was part of the Foundation for Economic Education as a trustee. Von Mises came, and his wife later with Bill Hutt's wife. Hayek, Milton Friedman, Ayn Rand. His story about Ayn Rand that I remember, he was waiting on it he came early for a meeting in New York City, and he saw there was this lady wearing dark clothes, and smoking furiously, and he thought, wow, this must be a witch. Some kind of crazy person was Ayn Rand. But, I mean, she's very special. He was the president of the Mont Pelerin Society, which is an honorary society for people who are identify with classical liberalism and so on. Margaret Thatcher, Ruth Richardson, you know Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister of Britain, Ruth Richardson of New Zealand, and many people who won the so-called Nobel Prize in Economics, Gary Becker, and so on. Vernon Smith, who's still alive and active here. Also in the Liberty Fund. He was a member of the board. So Muso everybody knew Muso. I mean, everybody that I knew, I would go to places, or they knew about this university. I was in Mongolia, and I met the guy, and he said, there's this university in Latin America. I don't know the name. He said, and it was this university he was talking about. And he said, I want to finance one. I want to start a university. So the reputation of university really is very wide. Now, this is Muso with Hayek. This is the original university, so you can see how much more comfortable you are sitting here. That was Muso. You should get up from that seat and turn around and thank the seat for that comfort. Well, thank him. This is that barranco, which was completely useless. What would you grow there? But there was a vision to turn it into this beautiful paradise. Thank you very much.